right, all you lovely people, are you ready to dive into some more Aristotle? So, early on in Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, we see Aristotle go back to his division of the soul. And now Aristotle is primarily interested in looking at just that rational aspect of the soul. And he wants to then look at, again, the excellences of the intellect in particular. Now, in general, Aristotle does believe, this probably isn't too surprising, that the function of reason and the function of the intellect is about truth. Namely, intellectual excellence is supposed to be what allows reason to grasp the truth to the highest degree. Now, there's something interesting we can actually note right away, is that, as I said, intellectual excellence is about reason grasping, attaining the truth to the highest degree. Again, the highest degree. And now that's what's interesting here is what we'll see is that the intellectual excellences, there is no intermediacy. There is no mean. There is no moderation, if that's what you like. Because, again, for the intellectual excellences, there is only defect, namely, you're not at the truth. You're not getting to the truth. And so the excellence, this one can be maximized, because you want to gain the truth to the highest degree possible. There is no excess of truth. There's only defect. You're not quite there yet. So you can't have too much of the truth. So again, the major difference then, and I think Aristotle would say this because there really isn't going to be emotion directly involved, no substrate, no continuum like we saw with the excellences of character. No, with the intellectual excellences, the goal is reason attaining the truth, and these excellences then have to be, fully charged to get that. Otherwise, again, defect is the problem, not attaining the truth. And so in any case, intellectual excellence really is about what allows reason to attain knowledge. That is, knowledge is reason's possession of the truth. Again, knowledge is reason's possession of the truth. This is why Aristotle sees the rational part of the soul as concerning our capacity for knowledge and truth. That's what Aristotle's going to be emphasizing. It's about knowledge, arriving at truth, or reason understanding that. However, Aristotle notes, this is kind of cool, is that there are different objects of truth or different objects of knowledge, which then Aristotle thinks, because there's different objects of knowledge, different objects of truth, will then need different capacities of reason or different faculties of reason that will apprehend those truths correctly. So if we go back to that rational aspect of the soul, and we've seen how Aristotle divided that into the executive and into the subservient parts, which we talked about already. But now Aristotle divides it again into two parts here. And just to note this new division, this is different from this is a new division. It's not the executive and subservient aspects, because now Aristotle is making the distinction between the scientific part and the calculative part of the rational part of the soul. Now, the scientific part concerns what Aristotle would say is knowledge of the necessary, knowledge of the universal, knowledge of the eternal. And so for Aristotle, he thinks this includes things like math, geometry, logic, universal, necessary, eternal truths. But he also, as you might think, as we call it scientific after all, he also does include the sciences here as well, when we're contemplating like the laws of nature, say. And for Aristotle, this scientific part of the soul mainly involves contemplation, just thinking about these math, logic, the sciences, and that's the extent of it. Meanwhile, we have this calculative part of the soul, and here knowledge is about contingent things, about particular things, about temporal things. And Aristotle thinks this type of knowledge, this calculative knowledge, is more practical, because he thinks it's about deliberation and about action. He says you don't deliberate whether 2 + 2 = 4. You don't deliberate on it. That's just a math problem we can contemplate. But no, what we ought to do, action, that we do, he thinks, we deliberate about. Because that's the calculative part or the deliberative part. It's about action. It's about, knowledge here is about how do we act in these particular situations in which we find ourselves. And so that's why the calculative part, here we can throw that back up, you can see the calculative part is connected then to that subservient part, because the subservient aspect, right, is about how we act on our emotions, desires, appetites. And so the calculative part of our reason is supposed to help us, of course, how to act in those situations with the subservient aspect of our lives. And so now here we can start walking through this a bit. So now we've seen overall the rational part of the soul is about gaining knowledge, and the intellectual excellences overall, again, are supposed to help us attain that knowledge, that, how where knowledge, again, is when reason grasps the truth of things. And now we can break that down into scientific knowledge, and that's that knowledge of the necessary, universal, and eternal. And then we have the calculative or deliberative knowledge, which is knowledge of the contingent, particular, and temporal. Now, Aristotle's going to say already, here we go, our first major intellectual excellence. He says now the scientific part of the soul has an excellence that is known as intellectual accomplishment, or Sophia is the Greek word there. So intellectual accomplishment, Sophia, this refers to excellences in doing, say, logic, math, and the sciences. This is what we've been talking about. Now, Aristotle thinks this Sophia, this intellectual accomplishment, he does think this is probably the greatest excellence of all. Because Aristotle thinks that when you're contemplating the eternal, the necessary, those are like the greatest things possible that we could, because they don't change, they last forever. And so when we're talking about rules of logic or about numbers and math or the laws of the universe and so on, he thinks doing all that stuff. Yeah, Aristotle's saying, you math and science students, use the bee's knees. You're doing the best stuff possible. But Aristotle goes further. So he does break down then intellectual accomplishment, or again, the scientific aspect of our minds, into two parts, with systematic knowledge and intelligence there. And now systematic knowledge. Systematic knowledge is, the Greek word here is episteme. God, it's been a while since I've said how to say Greek. Episteme, which is our ability to reason from premises to conclusion. Again, systematic knowledge, our ability to reason from premises to conclusions. For the logic nerds out there, that's deduction. Some of you maybe know. Okay. Anyway, what Aristotle is going to say is you don't have systematic knowledge. You don't have episteme, the excellence. You have it when you can show how something follows from established premises. For instance, in high school, a lot of you probably studied geometry, or as my instructor said, geometry. He was a very interesting guy. But here you had to prove all sorts of stuff, and you might remember that in those proofs you were given something as true, and then you had to use definitions and theorems to prove some sort of conclusion. And look, this is kind of cool. Those rules and theorems, those were your premises. And then, of course, you use those to prove your conclusion. So when you look at all of, what you did in geometry, you were training in the systematic knowledge of episteme, because you were learning how to reason from given statements, definitions, and theorems, reasoning from those to some kind of conclusion. And so Aristotle would say is that you don't know two lines are parallel until you can prove it from established premises. That's how systematic knowledge, again, that's how episteme works. It is reasoning from premises to conclusions. Now, meanwhile, we have intelligence, or nous. I like that word, nous. So we have intelligence and nous, and that is the ability to discover the established premises to be used to create that systematic knowledge. So again, nous is about what are the premises we can use. So remember, we have the systematic knowledge of episteme. That's about reasoning from premises to conclusions, but then you need intelligence. You need nous to figure out, well, what should those premises be? And I think if you study more advanced math, you kind of learn about how that actually works, because you want to prove, like, say, Fermat's last theorem wasn't proved until like 30 years ago. But the person who figured out that proof had to figure out, well, what were the starting points? What were the premises that ought to be used to prove this is true? And yeah, that required real intelligence to figure out what are the premises here that ought to be employed. When you took geometry, they just told you what they were. But intelligence is figuring out, well, what should those premises be in the first place? So read like Euclid's Elements. There he lays out what he thinks are the premises of geometry. Now, Aristotle seems to think that the intelligence of nous, now how this works is, because it doesn't just work in just math and those kind of premises, it's more general than that. Because what he thinks is that nous looks at a bunch of different particular things and then tries to figure out, well, what are the common generalities, or what do these things have in common with each other? Yeah, they all seem different, but what are the commonalities these things have? And that's how intelligence of nous works. It's figuring out the underlying universality or unity that connects different things together. And the nerds out there, again, the logic nerds will know that this is a type of induction. that Aristotle is probably thinking about here. And examples of just this type of nous, or this type of intelligence, would be like, say, when Newton saw the apple fall, he can, the particular thing happens, but then he's able to conclude, this whole account of gravity just from this particular events that he observed. We observe different things, but Newton does that, and then deduces a more universal idea about gravity. Or we could think about how zoologists, create these different taxonomies that combine, but also distinguish different types of animals. Like we have all reptiles are cold-blooded vertebrates that lay eggs, while mammals are warm-blooded vertebrates whose children grow inside the mother's body. And so the idea here would be is you don't really know what a reptile is until you know how it is similar to and yet different from other types of animals. And that's what zoologists and their taxonomies do. They try to figure out what are the universal commonalities and the differences. Kind of cool. But that's how intelligence of nous works, looking at particular things and deriving fundamental premises from them. And now again, Aristotle believes, we can go back to that picture there, Aristotle believes that the intellectual accomplishment of Sophia requires both of these excellences. That is, we need systematic knowledge to reason from premises to conclusions, but we also need intelligence to determine what the right premises will be. So we can see in that picture there are three intellectual excellences. We have the intellectual accomplishment of Sophia, the systematic knowledge of episteme, and the intelligence of nous. And now here's something interesting to notice about all these things. Aristotle is quick to point out these are all what we might call like theoretical knowledge, or involving theoretical reasoning, because they're not about action, right? They're about kind of contemplating and study, thinking about math, logic, or looking at the world and doing experiments to deduce from it. But none of these are about action themselves. None of these are just coming to discover, knowledge and truth about logic, math, and science, say. However, we've also seen from this picture, there are also excellences that do apply to action. That's, again, looking at this calculative and deliberative knowledge. Remember, the calculative and deliberative knowledge is the knowledge about the contingent, the particular, the temporal, the things that change, right? Because that's where our action is going to be. Because obviously our action is going to change the world in certain ways, or preserve it, whatever, right? We're interacting, and that's contingent in time, temporal, of the things that can change, as Aristotle says. But however, a lot there, right? It's kind of cool. But however, before we go on to that, let's take our another break here. This is a good time to stretch our legs, massage your brain, relax the eyes. I'll comb my hair. I'm getting a little disheveled. It's like amazing how your hair just gets disheveled. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway. Let's take that break, and then we'll come back and talk a bit more about intellectual excellence.